Tuesday we talked about the incentives of companies to create new products, right? And today we're going to talk about their incentives for how they should design an existing line of products. Like, what should those products be like? And in particular, what I mean by that is a monopoly's choice. So we sort of took, initially we took as given the product the monopolist was offering. Then we said, okay, well, what about the monopolist's incentive to create that product in the first place? And now I want to ask, what about the monopolist's incentive to make that product look one way or another way, design its non-price characteristics? So just as we have used the theory of monopoly, not just to think about like what a monopoly firm does, but also to think about like what the government would do, for example. We can use our thinking about how a monopoly would design a product to think about how to design some types of government policies. The problem set will have you do some of that. And we're going to look at these problems today from a variety of perspectives. First, we'll think about what are the goals that a firm has and what tools they use in designing products. We'll then talk about Spence's model, which you were supposed to read, of equality choosing monopolists, which was sort of like the foundational work on product design. And in particular, he emphasizes the difference between average and marginal consumers. We'll then talk about Hotelling's line model of spatial competition and apply that to the competition between newspapers and between political parties. And then we'll talk about what are called platforms, where the characteristics of the non-price characteristics of the product are actually generated by the people who participate. So at a nightclub, it's the people who show up at the nightclub that make the nightclub an attractive place to visit. Right? And finally, we'll talk about how you can design products to attract the most valuable people, and we'll apply that to insurance, to loan behavior, to platforms, and to a number of other contexts. So in considering the design of products, there's basically two things we need to keep in mind. So first, a firm has many goals and many tools when designing products. And the whole lecture is going to be about how to use those tools to achieve those goals. So its goals are usually, one, to keep costs low and to keep prices up, to attract as many consumers as possible, and third, to attract the most valuable consumers and avoid the more costly ones. And consumers may be more valuable either directly because, some consumers are cheaper to cover as a health insurer, or indirectly because they allow you to make money off of somebody else. So trying to attract people who spend a lot of money to read your newspaper is valuable because it makes you able to sell more ads to advertisers, right? And a firm usually has a variety of tools or instruments to use to try to achieve these goals. So one of those is price, and that's what we've been focusing on for the last couple of weeks, so I'm not going to talk much about that today. Second, which I also will focus less on today, is things that aren't just like a uniform price, but a non-linear price or a targeted price to different populations. That's sort of what we discussed in the price discrimination literature. But it can also adjust the range of products that it offers. How many different types of products. It can adjust the quality of the products, or how easy they are to use, how accessible they are, etc. It can try to target the product to some particular niche of the market, rather than broadly. Or it can try to target a mass market. It can choose how much to advertise, how much to market the stuff, how to place the products in TV shows and things like that. And it can also indirectly affect the attractiveness of its product by affecting the number of people or the types of people who use the product. So, obviously a huge concern for Facebook is who's using Facebook, right? So today we're going to try to study how a firm can use all these types of tools to achieve its goals of keeping prices up, attracting the most valuable consumers, and attracting as many consumers as possible. Okay. So a common way to divide up different of these tools and instruments are as ones that are vertical. And that means that all consumers agree that it's either good or bad. So price is the simplest example. Every consumer would prefer to have a lower price, right? But more generally, any sort of overall measure of quality, something that everyone, safety, reliability, etc., all those things would be considered vertical characteristics because all consumers agree that they're good. So speed of an internet connection, level of insurance coverage, all these things are vertical characteristics. Now consumers may differ in how much they value a vertical characteristic, but they all view it as good. On the other hand, a horizontal characteristic is something that some consumers view as good and some view as bad. And typically when we think about horizontal characteristics, every consumer will have sort of an ideal point along the horizontal dimension, and then they'll dislike something that's either to the left or to the right of that. So for example, spiciness of food might be a horizontal characteristic. Some people like it, some people dislike it, or in particular, everyone probably has some ideal amount of spiciness, and if it's over that, they're unhappy, and if it's under that, maybe they're unhappy. The color of your computer, styles, the political bias of the newspaper you read, all of these things are horizontal characteristics, things that divide people. Now, in reality, these are two very sharp distinctions, but most things fall somewhere in between. They're what I would call diagonal, which is that most consumers may view them as beneficial, but there may be some people who disagree with that. The key thing to notice about all of these is that it's not really inherently the instrument itself which makes something horizontal versus vertical. It's rather the nature of how consumers view that thing. Right? So what defines something as vertical is that everybody feels that it's good. What defines something as horizontal is that people disagree about whether it's good or not. So it's the heterogeneity among consumers rather than the inherent nature of the instrument itself which makes an instrument horizontal versus vertical. And in some sense, this whole lecture is going to be about how everything in the design of products is about dealing with the fact that different types of consumers are different. Okay, so Spence offered sort of the simplest model, allowing for a firm to choose a non-price characteristic and emphasize the importance of heterogeneity. So suppose that there's a bunch of consumers, and they can either buy a product or not buy a product. And each one of them is going to get a utility, which depends on the level of some non-price characteristic. This could be, the spiciness of the food, or it could be, the level of quality, or whatever else. And on the consumer's type. What is the consumer's type? This is just a bunch of stuff describing what the consumer is like, And the consumer's type are assumed to be drawn from some big multidimensional space, maybe, according to some distribution little f. Now, it's a little intimidating that there's some big, undefined space, but the key to all of these analyses, and please interrupt me if you're not following how we go through doing it, because it's going to be important for the problem set, is that all you ever need to use is Leibniz's rule. What Leibniz's rule says is that when you take the derivative of an integral, you get two terms, the integral of the derivative of the interior and the derivative of the boundary integrated over the boundary, times the interior integrated over the boundary. So what does that mean? That's a mathematical statement. What it means is that whenever you change anything, there are two effects. It can affect what people who continue to purchase the product do, or how happy they are, or something like that. And it can affect who purchases the product. Everything in the mathematical analysis is just going to be a mathematical way of expressing the idea that there are two effects, changing who's purchasing the product and changing what happens to the people who are currently purchasing the product.
Sorry. So the first part where you talk about the integration of the interior, that's for the consumers, the average consumer.
Yeah, that are still purchasing the product. And then
to
there's...
build the boundaries for the marginal.
Exactly. Okay. So how do we write this down? Well, so someone who gets a utility which is greater than the price is going to choose to purchase the product, right? And so the people who are participating are the people who have a type such that their utility, given the value of the instrument, exceeds the price, right? That's the set of people who participate. And the number of people participating is the integral over that set of the number of people of that type. That's all the density is. Right? Okay. So by Leibniz's rule, let's go through and actually use that. What happens when we change the price? Well, there's no dependence on price on the interior, right? There is a dependence on price on the boundary. When we increase by price, that's going to decrease the number of people who are participating, right? Because when this goes up, the set of people who have a theta such that this happens is going to go down, right? And so, the derivative of this whole equation is -1. So what do we get? We get the integral along the boundary, that is for the set of people who are indifferent between purchasing and not purchasing, right? The boundary is where utility is equal to price. The integral along that of the negative of the number of people. Everything on the problem set, everything that's challenging about it is just being able to use a rule like this. So if you can follow this rule, you're going to do great on the problem set. Okay, so let's call, and also follow how we label things to not have to have so many messy equations around. Because the thing that can most confuse you in these types of problems is you can have lots of like big ugly integrals like this unless you give them some name, so you don't have to like constantly be carrying around these integrals, right? So we're going to be giving names to things in terms of averages over people, numbers of people that are a certain way or something like that, and that's going to just make all the expressions much simpler. So let's call the number of people that are on the margin m, and then the derivative of the number of people with respect to price is -m. Right? Okay. And so by the inverse function theorem, how much the price changes when we increase the number of people is -1/m. Right? Okay. So we're going to call this the density of marginal users. It's like how many people there are that are marginal or indifferent between purchasing and not purchasing. And then we're going to measure, this n is measured as the fraction of people who might consume who do consume. Now we could actually measure it by the number of people, but that's just a normalization thing, so we'll just measure it by the fraction. And the cost is going to be cost of n, and it also is going to depend on the quality of the product. It might be cost for me to make the product higher quality, right? And so the firm is going to make profits and seek to maximize its profits. Its profits are price times the number of people it sells to minus the cost, which depends on the number of people and the quality. Okay. So what is the optimal price for the firm? Well, it's just the same thing we've done before, right? If we take the derivative of this with respect to the number of people, we get P times dPdn times P, which is -P/m, right? Which is the same as saying it's P plus P prime times n, and we set that equal to marginal cost, and we just get the standard monopoly equation, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. And I'm going to denote the marginal cost with respect to the number of people, what we usually call the marginal cost, C sub n, because there's also going to be a marginal cost of quality. Okay. So the more interesting thing is how does the monopolist set the level of quality? So first, let's consider what would be the socially optimal level of quality to set. So what is the total social welfare? Well, it's the utility received by everyone who consumes the product minus the cost of providing the product. Right? And now what I'm going to do, which is going to make